Okay, so now we have Joanna Page. So Joanna is a professor of Latin American Studies and the director of CRASH, which, for those who don't know, is the Centre for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities. It's based at Cambridge. And her research interests are generally connected to the relationship between science and culture in Latin America, but she has also worked on questions of memory, modernity, capitalism, posthumanism, new materialism, decoloniality, ecology, and environmental thought. That's a lot. Yes. She has published 6 monographs on these topics, including 5 that are open access, and her most recent book is on decolonial ecologies, the reinvention of natural history in Latin American art, and that's with Open Book Publishers. Over to you.
Thank you, Sasha. I'm very aware that I'm the only thing standing between you and a glass of wine at the moment, so I'm not going to speak for long. If anybody wants to get up and stretch for 20 seconds before I start, please feel free to do that while I'm just arranging my stuff on the desk. In 1827, Alexander von Humboldt began a series of 61 public lectures at the University of Berlin. They were attended by hundreds of people, causing traffic jams in the city. In her biography of Humboldt, Andrea Wolff writes, "By not charging any entry fee, Humboldt democratized science. His packed audiences ranged from the royal family to coachmen, from students to servants, from scholars to bricklayers, and half of those attending were women. This is particularly remarkable at a time when women were not permitted to study at university or even to attend meetings of scientific societies." In another recent commentary on Humboldt's work, a biogeographer praises his generosity in sharing his knowledge with many others. He suggests that perhaps today we're getting closer to the ideal that Humboldt envisaged, given the development of new open access publishing models and other approaches to make scientific knowledge freely available. I want to use the example of Humboldt's work and the more critical approaches taken to his legacy by 3 Latin American artists to explore the tensions between the practice of open research and the task of decolonizing knowledge. My main argument will be really a very simple one: that if we don't tackle the deeper inequalities that govern the global circulation of knowledge, our current dominant models of open research may produce research that is more accessible but less inclusive. Humboldt's Berlin lectures were exciting and innovative because they combined diverse fields of knowledge, including astronomy, geology, botany, zoology, and geography. His lecture material was eventually published in an epic and instantly popular work spanning 5 volumes with the title Cosmos, Sketch of a Physical Description of the Universe. Cosmos drew on various journeys that Humboldt took, but principally his expedition to the Americas between 1799 and 1804. This is a work by the Ecuadorian artist Oscar Santillán, called Lost Star. To create it, he took an early edition of one of the volumes of Cosmos and subjected its pages to a chemical process. This allowed him to extract the ink, which he then formed into a miniature globe and placed alongside the book, now, as you can see, with empty pages. The piece strips Humboldt's masterwork of its content, reducing its vast enterprise to a minuscule sphere, in a way that seems to mock its global aspirations and influence. At the same time, the tiny black globe of extracted ink, rather like a gemstone in appearance, brings to mind other forms of extraction. Lost Star could be read to allude to the relationship between scientific knowledge and the commercial exploitation of America's natural riches, including precious metals. It also encourages us to see Humboldt's volume itself as a work of extraction, mining the Americas for data that would serve the interests of Europe. In its attempt to provide a physical description of the entire planet, Humboldt's enterprise was, as Mary Louise Pratt observes, by no means independent of the great projects of commercial and political expansion that Europe was articulating simultaneously on a global scale. Humboldt was not ignorant of the commercial potential of the knowledge that he sought. Although he exalted the study of nature primarily for its capacity to enlarge the intellect, he wrote in Cosmos that science thus followed for her own sake will pour forth abundant, overflowing streams to enrich and fertilize that industrial prosperity which is a conquest of the intelligence of man over matter. That industrial prosperity was largely reserved for Europe, however, and it was fueled by the extraction of raw materials from Latin America, just as the growth in European scientific knowledge was significantly propelled by the data obtained by Humboldt and other traveling naturalists on the continent. The commercial value of scientific knowledge is also the theme of an installation by the Colombian artist Antonio Bermudez. And the work gathers together prints of the Chimborazo volcano in Ecuador. It's an iconic image that was published in another of Humboldt's best-selling albums. The prints were sold and shipped to the artist by galleries, bookshops, and antique shops across the world. Their labeling in a range of languages draws attention to the transnational circulation of Humboldt's images. Their commercial value and global reach are also apparent in the display of receipts for their purchase and the packaging in which they were sent, often, as you can see here, with customs declarations labels still attached. Seeing the prints exhibited together highlights the discrepancies between them. The engravings have been finished by different colorists, for example, and some labels situate the volcano in Colombia rather than Ecuador. Even the original engraving is a work of fictional composition, as Humboldt himself admits. Like many images of the New World avidly consumed by Europeans, this one was designed and executed by artists who had never set foot in the Americas. Humboldt's scientific texts, interspersed as they were with lavishly illustrated plates, were never separate from a commercial endeavor to sell exotic and often erroneous visions of the New World. The agave plant that you can see in the foreground of this image is in fact rarely to be seen in the Andes. Despite these fabrications, these images have continued to shape perceptions of Latin America. Humboldt's legacies have been studied more extensively by another Ecuadorian artist, Fabiano Cueva. His Humboldt Archive is a transmedial exploration of Humboldt's voyage through the Americas. The project has involved fieldwork, archival research, performances, exhibitions, the creation of videos, and the staging of public debates. Humboldt's relational approach to studying organisms and environments has often been hailed as a significant precursor in the development of modern ecological thought. Cueva's aim, however, was to draw out the rather less positive environmental, economic, social, and epistemological consequences for Latin America of the European pursuit of a universal discourse of science in which Humboldt played a key role. I'm going to play a short clip from Cueva's video essay, Humboldt 2.0. In the video, in a voiceover, he interweaves passages from Humboldt's texts with concepts developed by Latin American decolonial scholars.
Control económico, social y simbólico del mundo. Medir. Ciencia universal, hegemonía cognitiva, superioridad de unos conocimientos sobre otros, control económico, social y simbólico del mundo. Medir, recolectar, calcular, catalogar, archivar, relatar, Naturalizar América.
It's through these operations that Cueva lists here that science established an authoritative account of the region. Through these as well, it cast America as an object of study rather than a producer of knowledge, a place of nature for Humboldt and not of history. Cueva's video uncovers the relationship between Enlightenment science and coloniality, and with what Boaventura de Sousa Santos has called epistemicide, the systematic destruction of the knowledge and cultures of indigenous societies. The role of Humboldt and other scientists was crucial in forging the Enlightenment ideal of a neutral position from which the natural world could be described in a universal language that was valid for all times and all places. That language effectively excluded other systems of knowledge. Santiago Castro Gomez, a scholar from Colombia, argues that imperial power is established through the imposition of one single and reliable way of knowing the world, that which is supplied by the techno-scientific rationality of modernity. Decolonial scholars use the term coloniality of knowledge to describe a double process: how the imposition of European systems of knowledge on the colonized world strengthened imperial power, creating a global order that is still dominant today, but also how conquered communities were denied the right to be knowledge creators of an equal status. In his video, essays, and texts, Cueva comes back repeatedly to a single quotation from Humboldt. "My first expedition I undertook alone with an Indian." The paradox at the heart of that sentence speaks volumes about Humboldt's construction of a land without science, as he effectively erases the existence of his native guide, who not only shared his expertise with him, but as Humboldt explains in the same letter, risked his own life in helping him to climb the Chimborazo. Researchers have started to pay much more attention to the local botanists and other scholars who helped to shape many of Humboldt's ideas, and whose names are little known or entirely unrecorded. In Cueva's work, Humboldt also emerges as a central figure in the European exercise of knowledge by accumulation, a tactic that involved the removal of thousands of specimens, samples, and artifacts from Latin America to Europe to be classified and studied, and where they're still kept in closely guarded museums and depositories. Cueva has attempted to access archives and other sites relating to Humboldt in multiple countries across Europe and Latin America. For the most part, he filmed and photographed those archives illicitly, having signed documents committing himself to the quote-unquote ethical use of images in line with copyright laws. He decided not to respect those laws. Why not address the ethical dimension of the collections itself, he asks. Why not focus on their possible return to the places and communities that they come from? The Humboldt Archive is fundamentally a project about dispossession, reflecting on how a continent came to be treated as a repository of resources for the global economy, and what makes it possible for many of its most valuable artifacts to continue to be held in European museums. Humboldt's Cosmos is now readily available on open access. The fact that the work is freely available to all internet users, however, does not address the extractions and erasures that accompanied its passage into print and its dissemination across the world. Indeed, open research may in some instances reproduce the coloniality of knowledge, shoring up Anglo-European power over what knowledge is produced and how it is disseminated. The desirability of public access is also one of the key arguments made by European museums wishing to retain objects from colonized countries that were acquired through illegal or unethical means. Latin American documentary makers have narrated the return to indigenous communities of human remains held in European institutions. Calafate traces the journey taken by indigenous inhabitants of the southern tip of Chile, who were kidnapped at the end of the 19th century and taken to Europe to perform in travelling human zoos. They suffered early deaths, and their remains ended up in an anthropology institute in the University of Zurich. Damiana Grigi follows the restitution of a little girl's remains to her community in Paraguay from where they were taken, as objects for a study that we would now recognize as promoting scientific racism. In both cases, the human remains are eventually given a traditional burial by the communities that campaigned for years for their release, and for whom a material connection with the land of their ancestors is hugely important. When does it become more ethical to take something out of circulation, to bar access to it, to prevent it from being used to generate more knowledge? In the cases narrated in these films, the return of the remains opens up the possibility of a genuinely intercultural interaction, an encounter with values that may be at odds with those of creating and disseminating scientific knowledge as effectively as possible. We should never stop asking who benefits from open research. Does everybody benefit from open research? UKRI's new policy requiring all research it funds to be published open access, including now monographs, is on the face of it a significant and positive step towards making research freely accessible to readers across the world. But like many UKRI policies, it is also designed to bring economic benefits to the UK, in this case to make UK researchers more competitive in the global economy of knowledge. It's our knowledge that will be spread further, read more, cited more. If open research amplifies our voices, whose voices will be diminished? Are we moving towards a system in which research may be more accessible but less inclusive? UKRI has committed a sizable fund to pay for this. But in this way, the policy effectively entrenches an open access publishing model that looks to recoup its costs from authors or their funders, rather than looking elsewhere for a more equitable and sustainable model. Ultimately, a version of open access publishing in which authors or funders pay reinforces a system in which the rich world produces knowledge that is consumed elsewhere. Even more problematically, of course, that knowledge is often based on data and labour that comes from poorer regions of the world. Even a system that makes research free for authors and readers may threaten the livelihoods of scholars in other countries. Those of us with full-time academic positions in Europe do not need book royalties to supplement our income. But in some other countries, academic salaries in the state sector are not enough to live on, and researchers are expected to take on other jobs in translation or teaching or journalism to make up a living wage. For those scholars, book royalties may make an important contribution to their income. What will happen to that income in an open access world? If we don't find better models, open research might become rather like free trade. It sounds wonderful and egalitarian, but it may only deepen inequality. Our current models of open access are not sufficient to tackle the underlying inequalities that govern the production and circulation of knowledge across the globe, much less to secure what Santos calls cognitive justice, the right to coexistence of multiple forms of knowledge, not all of which are compatible with Western science. Perhaps it is too much to ask of open research that it tackle those inequalities, but it's in our hands to make sure that it doesn't add to them. What might a radically inclusive open research look like? I don't believe that disseminating knowledge should be the business of business. I believe that it's the mission of the university. I believe that bringing academic publishing in-house to universities and academic societies would be a good way of starting to address the inequalities that govern the market of academic scholarship. Universities could choose, if they wish, to work with independent not-for-profit publishers, supporting them through subventions. Articles and books would be free to both authors and readers. The vast sums that universities are currently paying for article and book processing charges and journal subscriptions would go at least some way to financing editorial work and book production. And as we know, the labour of peer reviewing is largely supplied free by academics already. Cambridge would not only publish research by people based at Cambridge. In my vision of the future, universities would form consortia with institutions across the world to secure good routes to publishing for scholars from lower income countries. This would diversify the knowledge that circulates globally and create the conditions for richer debates and exchanges. I don't yet know how such a system would work in detail, but I am more sure of the principles that I think should underpin it. Whatever infrastructures we create should be polycentric rather than centralized to avoid the power inherent in accumulation. We shouldn't be looking for a single universal system, which, like Humboldt's, increases the sum of knowledge, but at the same time concentrates power in the center, which manages how that knowledge is produced and disseminated. If we're committed to pursuing radically inclusive open research, that ultimately means giving up the right to decide which model may work best. In building infrastructures, we should pay attention not only to obvious barriers, such as paywalls, but less visible ones, such as who decides on the norms of academic publishing. Open research is only really open if everyone can participate and everyone can shape the norms of that participation. We should look for structures that break down boundaries between the academy and other forms of knowledge practice, allowing us to engage with knowledge producers outside of formal institutions. We should also think seriously about cases in which research should not be open. How are we going to identify those? Only by including in our debates those whose livelihoods may be at stake in an open access world. And we should accept that we're unlikely to create a good system if we base it entirely on familiar values, however enlightened those might be. Instead, we should draw on diverse paradigms of public knowledge and knowledge as a commons, including those developed in other cultures and communities. So the move to bring publishing in-house would actually become a much more profound opening out of the university to the rest of the world. To any budget holders in the room, this is not a meticulously costed proposal, but it is a provocation to us to do the kind of work that is necessary to find out what might be possible. Thank you.
Yeah, could you open up this polycentric? You know, how do you propose that could happen?
So I guess something quite simple in the sense that I don't think it should be based here, or at least not solely based here. I think we need a flexible kind of environment in which lots of different universities and institutions can propose their own models. So this is why I had the idea of consortia, kind of loose connections and constellations of institutions around the world that would themselves develop their own publishing models and systems, simply to get away from that idea that we have to invent it here, because I don't think that's going to meet the needs of everybody.
So mine is sort of like a comment on what we do in at the Faculty of Education, the Real Center. So we have the African Education Research Database, which is free and accessible by everyone within the global north and south as well. And we're doing this to break the barriers that people struggle to go through to have access to publications. And now we are on an agenda where we, in partnership with Education Sub-Saharan Africa, Hilton Foundation, and also the Gate Foundation, on how can we bring to the forefront research that is being led by Sub-Saharan African-based researchers, because we know the politics that goes into publishing and so on and so forth. So just to amplify the fact that today's topic, the open research, and on what you just presented, how important it is, and the fact that the gap that exists between the global north and people who are based in Sub-Saharan Africa particularly are suffering in terms of publication. And I came back recently from a workshop that we organized, supported by same funders, in Nairobi. And researchers who are within early childhood development and foundational literacy and numeracy. These are very important areas in terms of human development. Yet, we do not know much about the part of the world that are suffering most. And meanwhile, there are researchers who live there, who are based there, and who know the issues pretty much well, and who can tell us the narrative very well, where their narrative will be, can be very useful in global policy engagement as well as national engagement. Yet, when they write, and pretty much with high quality, it doesn't go out there, or even for those who get to publish, it doesn't go into open access. And so pretty much, always what happens is then that we are likely to take just, those that are able to go into open access and use those such knowledge to influence policy. And I've always argued that when that happens, then it will be like putting a square peg on a round hole. It's not going to fit. We need to also know evidence from the global south, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is the project we're also doing. But I also wanted to ask the octopus, not to answer, but something that you might want to consider. How do you go beyond the boundaries of Cambridge and the UK to other part of the world to let people who are doing research but can't also get these opportunities? How do you go beyond these boundaries? And I think that it is very much, very, very important. Thank you.
So if there are no more questions, we'll... Oh, there's one. Okay. We'll take your question and then I'll wrap up.
Hi. Is this one? Hello. Thank you. So really, really fascinating talk. Thanks so much. I'm struggling to formulate this in my head, but I'm just thinking out loud here that you've talked about the publishing models that need to be changed. And it seems as though there are also almost models within the university itself from which those models of publication end up flowing. So I've heard it described that there's almost the legacy of Humboldt's, the STEM subjects, who are the most keen on campaigning for open access. There is a sense in which those STEM subjects are colonizing the humanities. So the kind of department that you might work in the modern university could be described as essentially being colonized by that. By those measurements, those impact factors, and so on. So is there a change that needs to happen within the university, not necessarily to do with publishing, in order for then the models of publishing outside of the university to change? Do you think that's a correct distinction there between those two kinds of model, and what might be the relation between them, if that makes any sense?
Thanks. Yeah, I think I've understood you, but tell me if I haven't. I would hesitate, I think, to use... I don't feel that as in a humanities department that I'm being colonized by science at all. I do think that the university needs to be more aware of disciplinary difference when it comes to debating issues around open research, but I think a lot of people in this room are really aware of that and have been working really, really hard to try and overcome that. I think some of the models that are being developed at the moment work better in some disciplines than others. I guess that's a debate that's internal to the university. It becomes even more complex when you think of the range of different kinds of knowledge that are being produced around the world that aren't even necessarily attached to formal institutions. Or don't fit quite so well into disciplines. And absolutely the use of metrics in those situations does not capture the richness and kind of diversity of the knowledge that we want to bring to encounter one another and to exchange one another. So yeah, I think a lot of that thinking needs to be done very carefully.
Yeah, I was thinking, Joanna, about what you were describing, the different repatriation scenarios, which are they're the in-your-face scenarios, aren't they? Really. So I'm thinking about perhaps some of those more hidden ones, particularly when it comes to things like data ownership, as well, and how we account for that when we're collecting data, for example, like on-field work for archaeologists or doing anthropological research and so on. And as far as I know, there aren't any clear kind of measures or principles in place. There are the CARE principles. I can't remember exactly what they stand for, but that's about indigenous data governance, which is really interesting to think about in this space when it comes to kind of data ownership. But there must be a number of scenarios where some of those processes are going kind of under the radar and we're not aware of them. So there has to be some kind of transparency, accountability for that, when, say, it's a bunch of, UK researchers publishing a data set.
Of data that really could be considered to belong to somebody else, or that we're benefiting materially from using that data. Yeah, I think that's exactly the kinds of cases that I had in mind when I was saying we may need to relook at these things. I mean, to take another extreme example that I think would be ethically uncontentious, would be, if you could imagine a community living in the Amazon that has developed knowledge of plants over millennia. Would we support them giving their data away free to researchers from a multinational pharmaceutical company? No, that's obviously not correct. But there are a lot of shades of grey. And I think, going back a little bit to what Siddharth was talking about this morning about the inside and the outside, we need to be really aware, even as ethically engaged people doing research that we hope is responsible, we need to be really aware that we are already in an economic system where we are materially benefiting from data that is provided by other communities. It's not a level playing field to start with. And then we need to think about how we put in place open research in a way that doesn't exacerbate those inequalities. If anything, we want to try to diminish them.
No more questions. Okay, thank you so much, Joanna.